I've been a writer my whole life. I started very young, actually in my 20s, and I wrote and won Emmys in television and won a humor award in Playboy magazine, which now seems a little discredited, but at the time was considered a pretty big thing. And my friends, the comedians that I've worked with over the years as a director and just friends of mine, sort of missed me performing, and they wanted me to get back on stage. They wanted to hear how I was interpreting what was going on now. So I didn't feel like doing that, and I thought I'd try to write a conventional autobiography. And I know, since I've been involved in show business and directing and starring in my own shows and all of that, along the way you just meet everybody. And I know the brightest and wittiest people in show business, from Johnny Carson, Groucho Marx, to Seinfeld, to Larry David, to everyone. And I wrote about 70 pages, and I put it down, and I looked at it 2 weeks later, and I found that in the stories I'd written about these brilliant people, I was the funniest person in all the stories, and they came out like dolts. And I thought, this is too arrogant and self-serving. I got to find another way. So I revisited an old friend, the Bible, which had been sort of a source of my earlier material in Second City, and a reason the Smothers Brothers was thrown off the air by a sermon I had done on the Bible. And I started to write it in this biblical style, God and me, almost like a comedy team. And that seemed to be more inventive and creative and interesting. It took me forever, over a year. The result is the Book of David. I grew up in Winnipeg, Canada. My parents had come over from Russia. My father spoke to me in Hebrew from very, very early when I started talking, so I went to Hebrew University in Israel. So I had a quite extensive Jewish background and biblical background. When I joined Second City when I was 21 years old, it never occurred to me to use any of the material from, having been a theological student and been in Israel and all of that. And one of the directors at Second City said, well, why don't you just do that? And I thought, you don't get it. I'm much too hip and cool and to go back to the sort of Jewish background. And one night there was a suggestion from the audience for sermons. It just came up. And at Second City you improvised based on whatever suggestion you got. And I went in and I said, I'll take any suggestion of any Old Testament personality. And I improvised a sermon playing a Reformed rabbi really on the dumb side. And it worked well, and I started to use my background that way. People always ask me, what did my father, what did my mother think of me going into show business? They were just happy that I was in any business. There was no indication as a kid that I was anything other than a punishment from God as a child. My dad used to curse in Yiddish sometimes when I would drive him nuts and say, not one, but two like yourself, I wish you. My two daughters aren't quite as bad as I was. They were just happy that I landed anywhere because at that time no one knew where I was going to end up. One of the interesting parts of the book to me is that it's done in this biblical satirical style. It's hard to imagine that the stories that I'm telling are real, that they really happen. I didn't know how to do that. The editor of Simon Schuster worked with me, David Rosenthal, said, well, that's what you use footnotes for. So if you read the footnotes, you get a sort of way in which I just talk normally version of what really happened. That became a great kick for me, just the footnotes alone. So in the footnotes, you sort of get my stand-up self, and in the biblical sense, you get a little bit of sort of my irreverence, I guess, if you will, for the Bible, but still a very active relationship with God and me in dialogue all the way through my entire career. It was very hard to sustain the biblical style all the way through the book. It took very sort of careful writing. I used the St. James Bible as the guide, and as the book goes on, I lean on the satire less of the Bible and more just in the sort of style of storytelling that the Bible offers. And I felt that ultimately it worked, but halfway through, 70 pages, I didn't know that I would be able to find another 70 pages in this style. And just by sort of cherry-picking stories of my career, not the ones that I would tell if I was writing a conventional book, but one in the sort of biblical style seemed to fit, and that's how I did it. The stories that I cherry-picked were what I thought were the most influential. I do talk about going to Lenny Bruce. I talk about how I started at Second City just by seeing them at the University of Chicago and following them basically like a kid follows the circus. I talked about being best man at Joey Gallo, Crazy Joey Gallo, the sort of well-known mobster's wedding. That's a real story. And in general, when I talk about The Tonight Show, I sort of exaggerated and satirized just how big The Tonight Show was by just going through a litany of all the stars I've known one way or the other, or even not known, through the 70s, 80s, 90s, and into the millennium.